Welcome to Mind, Crime, Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we are joined by Brian Vickery to discuss Julian Assange. So, Brian, who is Julian Assange? He's kind of dropped off the radar a little bit in the last year or so. So who is he? I remember he was associated with WikiLeaks. So could you just give us a bit of background as to who he is, what WikiLeaks is, and how they sort of came to the public eye?
Right, yeah. I'm guessing for me, at my age, WikiLeaks seems quite current, but for the youngsters, it probably feels very much like history. Julian Assange and WikiLeaks really came into public prominence in 2010 with the release of the Iraqi logs and the Afghanistan logs. And now, just for those that haven't got a clue what WikiLeaks is, it's a media organization that specializes in the analysis of censored and otherwise restricted material involving war, spying, and corruption. Now, what it isn't, it doesn't hack. It isn't a hacking organization. Individuals send information to WikiLeaks via a secure system that protects their privacy, their anonymity. And WikiLeaks then takes this information, helps. I mean, not always. They work with media partners, and they provide a repository for this information. Coming back to the release of the information in 2010, this information was provided to WikiLeaks by Bradley Manning, who's now Chelsea Manning. And it was this WikiLeaks then worked with the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and many other news outlets to publish this information. Now, the file that most people of my age, and I mean, I'm guessing a lot of people remember, is the so-called collateral murder video, which shows an Apache gunship. First of all, it killed journalists and other civilians, and then the aircraft came back for a second bite and killed civilians who were going to aid the journalists and the other civilians, in killing some of those in the van and badly injuring the children. There's thousands of releases in these logs. It showed that the US had killed in excess of 700 civilians, including pregnant women and men taking their wives to hospital, etc. The US was consistently underreporting civilian deaths. They're handing over prisoners to the Iraqi police, who were torturing and electrocuting these prisoners. Other information, the Danish forces were handing over prisoners to face the same fate. And also this information, it did show that insurgents were being trained by Hezbollah in Iran. And the releases are sort of far too numerous to go through here.
So what's Julian Assange's relationship with WikiLeaks? Is he the founder or like his major operative? Was it his idea?
Yeah, sorry, I should have said Julian Assange founded WikiLeaks in 2006, and he was the editor until I believe about 3 years ago. I can't remember exactly when he obviously can't edit WikiLeaks from prison. He was the main editor when he was in the embassy.
Okay. Didn't WikiLeaks have something to do with the Clinton emails as well, from memory?
Yeah, they did. And I think we need to make clear for our American friends who may be Democrats that this extradition trial is absolutely nothing to do with any leaks in 2016, any leaks from DNC, Podesta, or Hillary Clinton. Now, I have my own views on this. My first thought is that maybe the Democrats should have selected a candidate that could have won on her own merits rather than manipulating the system. But and again, there's no real evidence that Russia hacked the DNC. It's made a great story for 4 years, the Russiagate story. But I like to sort of quote what people say under oath. The head of CrowdStrike, which is a company that investigated the leak, he said under oath that there's no concrete evidence that Russia hacked the servers. So, but at the end of the day, this extradition has nothing to do with any Russiagate or any hacks in 2016.
Just on the Clinton thing, that makes sense. Wasn't it the case that WikiLeaks always said it was a DNC insider who I don't know if they confirmed, but was believed to be Seth Rich, who mysteriously committed suicide? Isn't this? Am I remembering this correctly?
Yeah, I don't know if WikiLeaks actually said this.
Okay.
I'm trying to be careful not to sort of go into too much speculation.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there's masses of speculation from all sides about Russiagate.
Mm-hmm.
Julian Assange and WikiLeaks consistently deny that the source was Russian. And at the end of the day, the information that they released was in the public interest. And just as an aside, DNC actually took WikiLeaks to an American court, and the judge found that WikiLeaks acted as any publication could. And I'll just quote his statement here. The type of information is plainly of the type entitled to the strongest protection that of the First Amendment offers. They were doing, as all these things, they were doing what journalists and publishers should be doing. Just because the Democrats didn't like the fact that their candidate lost doesn't take away from that is the role of a journalist and a publication.
Has there been anything else that's major that WikiLeaks has released? The two I remember is the Iraq and the Clinton emails. Is there anything else that was pretty major that they've released, or is it just pretty much those two?
They've released things more recently, and it's to do with security, how the American security establishment have the ability to hack into phones, etc., and also they have and I'm trying to think, I don't know the name of it, so I haven't done my research deep enough, but basically the security services have the ability to hack into something and leave footprints as if they're a different nation or a different security service. So it's quite smart stuff they're dealing with.
Yeah, that makes sense. One last thing. My understanding is nothing WikiLeaks has ever released has been found to be false. Is this? This may be an exaggeration. It may be like 98%, but my understanding is they've never been proven to lie about anything.
I've also read that repeatedly. Now I haven't done. The problem is people can make that statement, and it's a very hard statement to disprove, isn't it? So, but I'm guessing that if it wasn't true, the likes of the Guardian and all these other newspapers would be very quick to highlight it, because, to be honest, WikiLeaks has made most of the news outlets seem second rate.
Oh yeah. I just wanted to clarify that, to say, WikiLeaks is, irrespective of what you think they've done, they seem to be producing accurate information. So that gives us a bit of good background. So we now have a situation that Julian Assange is at present under British custody. But if we dial back historically, Julian Assange was going to be extradited to Sweden, if I remember correctly. What is the sort of official case as to why he was needed to be extradited to Sweden, and what is really going on in this case?
Right. I could talk for the rest of the evening about the Swedish case. For first off, Julian Assange wasn't charged by Sweden. They basically opened an investigation that looks like a fit-up. They basically never charged him, but they managed to keep the investigation open for years. I have a quote here. Nils Melzer, who's the UN rapporteur on torture, and he can read. He's actually read the information in Sweden, so it's he's reading the original stuff, and he says that the Swedish police constructed a story of rape. If you actually start reading it, the two women involved didn't make the accusation of rape. It was actually set up by the police, and I haven't got time to go through all the details, but basically the police and the prosecution in Sweden ran with this story, and then the British and Americans used that as a pretext for trying to get hold of Assange in the UK. The reason that Julian Assange went to the Ecuadorian embassy and applied for political asylum was and history shows he was spot on. He feared that the attempt to extradite him to Sweden was just a pretext to send him to America, and obviously that's what's happening now. The Ecuadorian government gave Julian Assange political asylum, but both Julian Assange and the Ecuadorians said that if Sweden had offered if they'd made the assurance that he wouldn't be sent on to America, he was happy to go to Sweden to face any investigation.
To what extent do we know that the Swedish setup was a setup? Was this a conscious setup by the Swedish police? Was this directed by the American intelligence agency? To what extent do we know of this rape setup? Was, as you just said, there's no actual account. They just kept the case going. I mean, to what extent the details do we know of this story?
Yeah, again, I'm trying to be careful because these things are very sort of. It's very easy to make accusations, and we're obviously talking about two women here, and I don't like the idea of trying to rubbish two women who they can't answer for themselves. What I will say is, after the release of the documents in 2010, the Obama administration basically tried to inundate Assange with criminal cases, or they were recommended to do this. Their first attempt was they actually sent a plane load of FBI agents to Iceland, and in the words of the Justice Minister, he said, "What I understood as an operation set up to frame Julian Assange." So they were obviously looking for a reason to get Julian Assange into custody. It's very difficult without going through sort of tons of information about what went on in Sweden to actually. I'm not going to clear Julian Assange's name. If he didn't face the threat of being taken to America, he could have gone to Sweden to clear this up for himself. That's the problem. He was never given that opportunity to go to Sweden without risking being sent to the US.
Yeah, understandably. What was the timeline between the release? What was the timeline of the Swedish arrest warrant? Like, what was the timeline between these two events? Because if they happened, how quickly did he get the political asylum versus the rape accusation and the release of the documents?
So the release of the documents was 2010. The rape allegation was 2010. He was in Sweden for several weeks, and he was given permission to travel from Sweden for a short time. He travelled to Germany, I believe. He had his laptop stolen, like it surprisingly happens to journalists who travel around the world nowadays. He then heard that the US had a secret, I don't know what you call it, a grand jury indictment to arrest him. And he feared that Sweden was going to, if he went back to Sweden, he would be extradited straight to the US. He arrives in the UK. The Sweden, and this is still 2010, and Sweden made the European extradition request, and it took 2 years. The extradition trial for the European arrest warrant took 2 years before he then sought protection in the Ecuadorian embassy. Is that tight enough for your information? Sorry, I'm starting to waffle.
No, that's great. That's great. What made him choose the Ecuadorian embassy? We're going to get into some later questions possibly, but what made him choose the Ecuadorian embassy, and what was his other candidates? As we see with Edward Snowden, he had a similar type figure. He fled the United States. He was in China and eventually ended up in Russia. What made him choose Ecuador? It's sort of happenstance how he ended up in the UK, from my understanding. What was that process like?
I trying to remember the name of the consul in. I think some of these things are just because of the people you know and the people that are prepared to talk to you and do this. I think he knew Fidel Narvaez, I think that's how his name's pronounced, the Ecuadorian consul, who was keen on. I think he was a civil rights lawyer before he became a consul, and so I guess in those circumstances, I've never been there myself, but you run to whoever is going to offer you protection. That would be I don't know for sure, but that would be my guess. I haven't seen the actual information why he went to Ecuador. There's probably a limited range of countries that would stand up to the US.
How long was he in the Ecuadorian embassy for? And what was the situation? Well, what caused his release from there? Or he's kicking out, more precisely.
Sorry, release. He was there 7 years, and I believe for the first 5 years everything worked pretty well. That the consul who I mentioned, he said everything was fairly smooth. It was only with the change in government in Ecuador that things started to go downhill. I did hear Fidel say that I can't remember the new president of Ecuador's name, but he possibly would have handed over Assange anyway, but a $4.2 billion loan probably helped sway his decision. But I think for the last 2 years of this sort of 7 years, things deteriorated pretty quickly. I won't go into all the details again, but the Ecuadorians they didn't have any security in the embassy, and when Julian Assange went into the embassy, they realized they needed a lot more security, because obviously the CIA and all these other people they became the most spied on embassy in the world possibly, and they employed a Spanish company to provide security. With this company, gradually the owner of the business ended up going to America, and he wanted to enter the big time, so it sounds like he ended up selling his soul to some Americans. And basically for the last 2 years of his time in the embassy, every move and every conversation Julian Assange had in the embassy was recorded and sent to what UC Global's boss called his American friends. So it's very likely that the American security services had total audio and video of Julian Assange for the last 2 years, which again, that includes when he was should have been having privileged conversations with his legal team.
If I remember correctly as well, when he was in the early part of the Ecuadorian embassy situation, didn't he have a show on Russia Today? Because I listened to one recently where he sort of moderates a discussion between Zizek and Tim, what was the other guy called? The American guy?
David Horowitz.
Yeah, I haven't. I haven't watched any of those RT shows, so I can't comment. It's often an accusation, isn't it, that people go on RT and they're, by the fact that they have a show on RT means they're a Russian asset.
No, Russia Today just hosts anybody who is against the current American interests. I mean, they're so obvious with that, but they'll just take anybody. I mean, Stefan Molyneux's appeared a few times on Russia Today. He hasn't had his own show. So they do have everybody. So that argument about Russia Today is just a bit silly, really. I mean, their motivations are obvious, but when you know that, you can kind of deal with them more reasonably. But yeah, it was just a point that his original time at the embassy, he could still do things, and he was kind of dealt with quite reasonably, I think. So the Ecuadorians kick him out after they get a big $1 billion loan. What happens next?
Well, I would argue they didn't really kick him out. The British government used our security, our police, to actually drag him out, which would be perhaps a bit more of an sorry, I'm not trying to correct you, but that's probably a more accurate description of what happened there.
What actually happened? I don't actually remember the details. Did they go in and take him out of the embassy?
Yeah. Oh,
really?
I don't know how true this is, but I did hear that that's the first time that a country has allowed another country to go onto their embassy to take one of their somebody who's got political asylum. It's not. I personally don't think it's a good look for the British, but
no.
One of the things that interests me about this is, I know you're hesitant to speculate, and Swithin wants to respond as well. I'm very much interested here in the role Britain has played in basically 100% submitting to the Americans. It's looking almost like American lapdogs almost in this whole situation. In this regard, I've been a supporter of Assange to a much extent of a supporter of Assange can be. I haven't really done anything, claiming, but I don't think he should be imprisoned. I think what he did is very honorable. But nonetheless, why has Britain been so quick to go along with the Americans? Are they looking for political favor, political patronage? What's the world? Because interestingly, in the Vietnam War, Britain basically stuck up LBJ on sending troops or even naval support in this regard. So it's very interesting to me, the situation there.
My feeling is it's probably a combination of both. Obviously, post-Brexit, the UK has to find new partners in the world, and I'm trying to use appropriate language. Upsetting too many people possibly isn't a good idea. So I think there's an element of that. I personally think, though, that the UK is an active and willing participant in most of these. I mean, not just with Julian Assange, but actions in the Middle East, even actions in South America. The UK Foreign Office is active in Venezuela. So I don't think it's just about being the lapdog, even though it looks a bit like that. I think the Foreign Office is probably see part of this as their role, and they like to play on the big stage.
So, do you want to comment on that? Because I in general find this quite fascinating as a sort of role reversal, because in some ways I think Julian Assange picked the wrong country to flee to. He should have fled to Italy or France if he wanted to stick to Europe, because I think some of those countries might have stuck their nose up for him and looked the other way.
Well, yeah, I mean the French haven't extradited Roman Polanski. Well, obviously significantly less politically important, but no, the French don't get on with the Americans. The Americans and the British didn't go back a long way with us doing the bidding of America. I haven't got the details hugely. I remember Peter Hitchens making the argument that they deliberately got us on bad terms with the Japanese because the Americans wanted to increase power out in there, and that's, I think, early 20th century. Before the Second World War. I wouldn't be surprised our current relation with them, which seems somewhat subservient, probably has something to do with the international financial order and keeping London at pretty much the centre of it. I think could well be one of the reasons. But it certainly does seem to have accelerated in the 80s, possibly when Thatcher came in, had a good relationship with Reagan. And it kind of developed more obviously from there. But yeah, certainly in the 60s and 70s, it was less close. As to what changed then, I don't really know. But yes, the British do seem to want to play to the Americans' tune. But as Brian says, it could well just be the case that we don't have the empire anymore, so we need to have influence on the world stage, and if we can do it via the Americans, well, then so be it. So that would be my broad take.
The other thing, just jumping in there, the Labour Party under Tony Blair changed. That's one thing that did change. I mean, the Labour Party under Harold Wilson in the 60s opposed Vietnam. The Tony Blair was a willing and active participant in what went on in the Middle East. Now, maybe he saw that was real politics, that the Americans were going to do what they're going to do anyway. But Tony Blair certainly didn't resist very much, did he?
No, he did not. Do we know that the as far as the $4.2 billion loan, whatever the number they got from Ecuador, to what extent was this the main driver, Julian Assange? I mean, this, to a certain extent, for some of these large international organizations and global finance places, this is almost small potatoes. Do we know the loan was done primarily to get Julian Assange? Was that the main driver of this loan, or was there other factors in this loan? Is this, it reminds me of the death. You have a death here. There's like, did he die of heart disease or a car accident? If we could single out the cause of this loan, to what extent did the Julian Assange buyout factor into this loan that Ecuador got?
Obviously, I don't have the information on why the loan was given or how much effect that had on the Ecuadorian decision. I think I said earlier, Fidel Narvaez, I can't pronounce his name, his feeling was that the new president of Ecuador would possibly have handed over Julian Assange anyway, that he wanted to change his relationship with the US, and it could have been just as much about wanting to cozy up with the US as much as the money. But that's the only information I have.
So he's dragged out of the Ecuadorian embassy and is in British custody. When did that take place, and what are they holding him under, and what has happened since he's been forcibly removed from the Ecuadorian embassy?
Right, I'm trying to get my dates right. I believe it was April 2019. Initially, he was charged for breaking his bail conditions. He was given 50 weeks. The maximum sentence for bail violation in the UK is 52 weeks. He was given 50 weeks. Apparently, the usual sentence for bail violation sort of is up to 3 months and possibly a fine even. So they threw the book at him for that. I don't know if at this point I could go in. I mean, I have, apart from the freedom of the press issues with Julian Assange, which are obviously quite large, for the UK, I think there's also a problem with how our justice system has been manipulated by the powers that be to go after one individual, and it's allowed itself to be manipulated. The judge in the original case was Lady Orthnot, and she should have recused herself. She has family who were investigated, who were the subject of WikiLeaks revelations. So she shouldn't have even sat on that initial trial, and she's still the supervising judge of the extradition hearings. But to answer your question directly, he was initially charged with bail violation. He was given a 50-week sentence and sent off to Belmarsh. That sentence ended in about October because he, as you know, most of our sentences are not, people don't complete them. Since then, he's just been held on remand pending the extradition hearings. I'll just go into the conditions of how he's held, because it's not too much of a stretch to call it torture. He's been in solitary confinement of 23 hours a day, without access to, until this week, without access to a radio, without access to a computer, television, lots of the things which would send us crazy if we were shut in a room for 23 hours a day. He was released from solitary confinement for 2 or 3 months, and that was because fellow prisoners in Belmarsh actually ran a campaign to actually get him out of solitary confinement, which it says a lot about our justice system when it's the prisoners themselves which get a change like that.
So just to clarify, so he's been held on remand pending extradition to which country?
The US.
Oh, to the US.
Sorry, I don't know if I made it clear. This extradition, the Swedish investigation, which was deliberately dragged out for 7 years, was shut. It was shut down several times anyway. The British prosecution service actively worked with Sweden to actually keep the charges going. The investigation going. But that's been closed down now. Julian Assange, the only thing he's going to the US for is the charges to do with the release of the Iraq and Afghanistan logs.
What's the official charge from the Americans? Is it a conspiracy to release confidential documents or something like that?
Yeah, sorry, I tried to find that to give you the exact charges, because I don't want to be. So he's been accused of one count of conspiracy to commit computer intrusion, and this was to help Chelsea Manning gain, and they're accusing him of to help Chelsea Manning gain privileged information. They're not saying he actually succeeded in doing this. The fact is, Chelsea Manning had already given access all this information to WikiLeaks prior to the accusation that Julian Assange had tried to help her break a password. The reason that Chelsea Manning tried to break a password was she's trying to protect her identity. And there's also 17 counts under the 1917 Espionage Act, which are basically to do with asking for information, receiving information, and publishing information.
Wasn't one of the claims from the Americans that the release of the documents endangered ongoing US operations? If that is the case, which I think it was, is there any substance to that claim, or is that just a pretext to extradite him?
They're claiming the charges that they're making these charges. What I'll do is go back to the Chelsea Manning trial, and again it was said under oath. Brigadier General Robert Carr. Now he was a counterintelligence officer, and he headed a 120 strong team that investigated the disclosures. And his words in the trial were, that they had uncovered no specific examples of anyone who had lost his or her life in reprisals that followed the publication of disclosures on the internet. So under oath, he actually said there was no examples. He could not provide any examples. And this is the obviously the release we're talking about, the Chelsea Manning trial. I mean, to be honest, I would hope that what WikiLeaks done does actually change future US actions. I don't really. I'm just hoping that maybe in the future, US military are slower to hand over civilians to be tortured. I would hope that Apache gunships are less inclined to shoot up civilians. So yeah, I'm hoping that it changes policy in the future.
Oh, I agree entirely. It's just that I remember being one of the claims as to why Assange was so dangerous and was a bad man, which is the reason I asked the question.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, you mentioned Belmarsh. For our American listeners, what's Belmarsh? Because they won't probably know what it is.
Well, I've heard it described as the UK Guantanamo Bay, but it's a bit like a supermax. That it's where we send murderers, terrorists. It's the harshest, the most secure, and I say harshest. I don't really know that. It's the most secure prison in the UK.
Have the British government given reasons as to why he's been in solitary confinement to 23 days? To 23 hours a day. Have they ever sort of justified that from any press questioning, or if there's no one asked the question, or if they have, they just ignored them?
I don't think the British press take a lot of notice, to be honest. They've until recently they've washed their hands of Julian Assange. More recently, it's the COVID. Julian Assange, because of his 7 years in confined in the embassy, he has a lung condition, and like most prisoners, I think the prison service is actually for the last 2 months has confined many prisoners to their cells for those hours. So I guess my complaint would be the sort of 8 months from when he was first arrested. I can almost understand why. I mean, you could actually say, well, why don't they just? He's never been accused of violence or anything. Why they don't put him on bail? But because he's a remand prisoner. But if you're going to be locked in prison, I guess solitary is where you're going to have to be at the moment.
What's the future for Julian Assange? Will he get extradited? I mean, it's been pushed back till September. He's stuck. He seems to be stuck in legal limbo. What's the situation here? Will they have a new judge? What's going to be the outcome? If you could speculate.
I will. I mean, from my sort of what I've heard, obviously the next session is in September. That will take course, and then it will be appealed, and eventually it'll be appealed up through to the higher court, and possibly to Europe. I don't know if it will go to Europe now, but they will. It went just because this judge makes a decision. I don't think it'll be bag him up and send him across to East Virginia, and that is one of the problems he faces if they do extradite him. You know how the American system works better than I do, but he will be basically sent to the Eastern court system in Virginia, where juries are made up of CIA, FBI, Secret Service operatives, because that's where they all live, and basically it'll be a secret trial, and they never find anyone not guilty there, and that's sort of fairly well documented. And he'll possibly be buried is under special administrative measures in a supermax in America, possibly for the rest of his days.
Isn't it the case that he's not been able to speak to his lawyers?
He has been speaking to his lawyers, but the access, even before the COVID problems, his access was very sporadic. The things which went on in court, apart from the fact he was shut in a glass box, couldn't talk to his lawyers there, couldn't hear the judge. The first day in court, when he left, he was strip searched twice. He had all his legal papers taken by the prison guards. His treatment. If I was on the prosecution, I would fear that there'd be a retrial based on the way they've treated him. But I think there must be concern about that.
Wasn't there a case where they went into recess and then the Americans turned up and talked to the judge, and things went more badly for him after the recess? I think I remember reading that somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, you've obviously read. I mean, I haven't gone through all the things which you. It's a litany of maljustice. I don't know what the correct term is. It's the American. There's Americans sat behind the prosecution in the hearing, and some commentators said it looks like they're actually directing things. It's almost unbelievable. I mean, at a British court, you have American officers. I don't know where they're coming from, state officials, whatever, running the prosecution.
Oh yeah, the whole thing is an extremely unjust thing to the extent that justice exists here. So the question is, why is this happening, in the sense that we see the case with Daniel Ellsberg or Eugene Debs. These are some of the historical people who've been stuck in a similar situation. Daniel Ellsberg got charged with the same thing, but he got out of it basically to a certain extent on a technicality, in the sense of illegal evidence gathering, which, it's 1973, and he was dismissed of all charges. But he stayed in the United States for almost the whole time. He didn't quote unquote make a run for it. But then again, Julian Assange is not even an American citizen, never was an American citizen, an Australian citizen. So that even makes it sound even worse. He's an Australian citizen being charged with the 1917 Espionage Act of the United States. That to me makes it even more dodgier. Although I understand there's a treaty with an extradition treaty anyway. So that's how that technicality happens. And I think public opinion has to play some role in why the intelligence agencies, the deep state, whatever you want to call it, are allowed to get away with this. And this goes back to unfortunately, the character of Assange. Assange is not that popular outside of dissident political circles, which me, you, and Swithin are all probably largely involved in. Now he gets support from other dissident left-wing figures like Noam Chomsky as well. To what extent is political opinion, public opinion, is a game in this? Because Daniel Ellsberg was released, but Daniel Ellsberg was basically a system guy. And Assange does have some other baggage. I mean, it's unfortunate, but what extent is this occurring for those reasons?
There's two things I'm going to cover there. The first one is Daniel Ellsberg was a whistleblower. Snowden was a whistleblower. Chelsea Manning was a whistleblower. Julian Assange is a journalist. We need to be careful. He's not. I've signed this. I worked in the aircraft industry on military aircraft. I signed the Official Secrets Act, and I respected the fact that I signed a contract. If I saw the company was taking part in illegal action, I would possibly feel I have a moral and probably a legal requirement that I would break my contract. The same as Chelsea Manning under US military rules. If you find if your army's breaking the Geneva Convention, you have an obligation to report it. So, but Julian Assange is a journalist. He has as a journalist, he actually you can argue he has a responsibility to search for this sort of information and publish it. So I'm just I hear a lot of people mix the two up, and that's where the freedom of the press, that's where the big risk comes. By prosecuting Julian Assange, they're going after the First Amendment rights for anyone outside of the US, and possibly within the US eventually. On the politics, you're
one second. Can I just click a button?
Sure.
tricky thing with Daniel Ellsberg is the Nixon's case against him. Nixon gave up the case, from my understanding of the Pentagon Papers, because the New York Times and Washington Post and all these other large media organizations basically engaged in mass civil disobedience and published the Pentagon Papers. So unless Nixon wanted to take on the whole American media establishment with the thing, it couldn't have happened. Now, again, it's been a while since I've looked into the precise historical details on that fact. From my understanding, this is where I think, to some extent, everyone's a journalist, unfortunately. Now, I do agree that there are people signed contracts if you find the official secrets acts and so forth. But then this goes back into an almost legal theory. If I think in California, if you sign a driver's license, in theory, you submit to having your car searched. I think that's the case. So to a certain extent, I understand the claim that he's a journalist, but I also, in some ways, this becomes a question of who is a journalist as well. So that goes back to the other question: is the New York Times stood up for Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers? I haven't seen that with Julian Assange at all, really.
I guess the New York Times and all the other newspapers in the 70s were protected under the First Amendment. As you mentioned, Daniel Ellsberg, they were going to prosecute him because he was a whistleblower, but they made the mistake. I think he had CIA operatives. I don't know all the facts, but they had them bug his conversation with his psychiatrist. So they under the US legal system, that's a no-no. From what I've heard, the British, because obviously Assange has had his attorney or his legal team communications between himself listened to, but the British legal system doesn't seem to place that much onus on correct procedures. It seems to be let go. The media, why doesn't the media? You'd think it's in their interest to actually back up Julian Assange, because they do very similar things and they could be next. Maybe there's a certain jealousy. Maybe some of them are actually like the Guardian. If you follow what happens to the Guardian is no longer the paper that printed the Snowden papers. It's actually being brought into the sort of security fold. It's now part of their. That sounds like a conspiracy theory, but the Guardian now sits on the committees and they have people in the right places.
Oh yeah, I would agree. I would agree to that. That's one of the reasons why I like Russia Today. I mean, if we're going to have, I think the New York Times is bought out. I say the Guardian is bought out as well. But I would totally agree with that. But you keep going.
So I was just going to agree on the politics side. I listened to a conference call with you won't know him probably in America, David Davis. He was the Brexit secretary. He was in the cabinet. I don't know if he's still in the cabinet. He is I'll say a libertarian light Tory, but he does have a good history of civil liberties and actually putting himself on the line about liberty. He stood up to Tony Blair on, I don't know if that was actually the extradition agreement in 2003. Anyway, I can't remember, but he actually resigned from Parliament to stand on civil liberties issues. So he has a genuine history on this. And he actually said that it's all down to political pressure. If enough people support Julian Assange, the politicians will listen. It sounds cynical, but that's what that comes down to at the end of the day.
I would tend to agree, which is why I brought up the Ellsberg comparison. I've been the fact that the CIA tried to set him up, or that's just like, to me, commonplace, considering what we know about the Gulf of Tonkin. Although the British, you've historically have set people up too. So to a certain extent, this is the pot calling the kettle black. I'm not defending the United States in any sense in that way, but nonetheless, I have been appalled by the fact that the New York Times, the Guardian, the big so-called democracy dies in the darkness types have totally been cowards about this. And does this have any role in the Hillary Clinton? Does the Hillary Clinton thing come back to bite Assange in this regard? Because if you look at common, mainstream left liberal people, not the dissident ones, they tend to hate this guy for some reason. They think he lost the election. They think he's a Russian asset. What does this story play back into it now? We sort of opened up with this. Well, Swithin did. Does this come back into his public? His public. The fact that no political pressure is being applied to it.
I think you're probably right. I mean, my view is that he maybe telling the truth is risky, and if you're prepared to upset both sides of the political spectrum, first of all he upset the sort of traditional conservative types that don't want to listen to people dissing the military or what they're doing overseas, and then in 2016 he upset the Democrats by dissing their candidate, and people don't like hearing the truth, I guess. And I think you're absolutely right about the US media. I mean, I think there's a risk from those of us. I mean, I use the term right just to describe ourselves, but we tend to, like the left do, we tend to lump everyone on. I mean, I like your term dissidents. There is a risk that we lump everyone on the left, like Democrats, Labour, in the same pot. There are a lot of genuine people on the left that absolutely detest what's happening in the American corporate media, and they're out there. They're not happy with. They certainly don't like the sort of Clinton, Biden, Democratic Party anymore. So their support. I mean, you're right. To use the term dissident, the people on both sides that try to think for themselves, and we may disagree strongly on economics, but there probably could be a bit of a meeting of minds when it comes to sort of liberty and rule of law, etc.
I would agree. Some of the sort of we might consider the far leftists have some quite interesting analysis. So yeah, I think yes, be careful not to put them all in the same camp. But back to Assange, if he is extradited to the US and he is convicted of espionage, what do you think this will do to the press? Do you think this is going to have a big dampening effect of what the press will publish vis-a-vis military matters, or just do you think it'd be further? Do you think they'll reduce the amount they'll say on any sort of controversial political matter?
Obviously, I'm not an expert on this. My feeling is the media had almost lapdogs. Most of the media lapdogs anyway. So perhaps I'm being a bit too brutal, but I don't have a lot of faith that they question what's going on anyway. It's bound on the. I mean, what I would say, this may only be the start, and it's bound to change. If you are an independent-minded journalist, it's bound to be on the back of your mind if you see that you could end up in a supermax jail for the rest of your days. The other place it has, it's not just the US and the UK. It's already this sort of policy of going after journalists. I'm trying to think. Brazil, Glenn Greenwald was charged in Brazil along the same lines, that he had a whistleblower, and the government there tried to go after him. Glenn Greenwald was lucky that Brazil had more independent-minded judiciary than we have, and a judge said no, it breaks the constitution. So so far he's been okay. But that is the risk that other countries. We like to hold ourselves up as a sort of beacon for freedom and liberty and rule of law. But once you go down that sort of slope of breaking it ourselves, like we look at China, Hong Kong doesn't have an extradition agreement with China. And when China tried to introduce an extradition agreement. Thousands of Chinese bravely went out on the streets to fight that extradition agreement. If we're busily sending journalists across to the US, how can we? Well, we will do. Hypocrisy's live and kicking in Whitehall, but it weakens our case to stand up to other things happening in the world.
Do you think if he is extradited, it will embolden the sort of corporate internet media outlets to kind of remove more people from YouTube or other things like that because they don't want to be associated or don't want to be seen to be purveying less than favourable lines of analysis vis-a-vis the US government?
I have to be blunt. I don't know. My feeling is it can't get much worse, but they seem to go along with whatever. Anyway, I guess just imagine if we had WikiLeaks, a vibrant WikiLeaks type system, and the information coming out about COVID and what's going on there. If we had a source of truth as opposed to like people on both sides just dishing out their favourite line, or even like, let's look at Salisbury, what went on in Salisbury, the Salisbury poisonings. We're sort of fed a line, and there's lots of question marks, but it doesn't take long before the BBC's releasing dramas and it's set in our minds that that's what happened. We don't actually have a source of truth for all these things, and that's possibly what WikiLeaks may have been able to achieve, and perhaps it's not going to be able to achieve now.
Thank you for your time, Brian. If anyone wants to find out about Julian Assange and his current situation, is there anywhere that you can kind of pick up new information about how his trial's going or things of that nature?
We run a site. We have a website called libertyforassange.uk. On Twitter, we're Liberty for Assange, and that's at Assange Liberty. And we have a Facebook page, Liberty for Assange. If you actually want sort of detailed, specific information, the DA, just Google it, or no, better still, duck and go it, would be is good for sort of lots of information, which I failed to give you tonight. With the Liberty for Assange site, we're trying to orientate it from a sort of libertarian angle. When it's not all libertarian sources, but we're trying to keep it from our space. We're trying to attract support because the problem is that much of the support is coming from the left, and as I said, there's a lot of good people there, but we're trying to broaden this the support into the libertarian space.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Brian. If you have enjoyed this show, please share it with your friends and family, and please subscribe on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, I think the higher we get in the search results. And if you would like to contact us with ideas for the show or any feedback that you might have, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.